12 years of marriage, and my husband still needs me to explain what contribution means.
Marissa built this brand from nothing. Some people just don't appreciate that.
I know exactly what I built.
You sanded wood, Ethan. I turned it into something people actually wanted. Marissa, this probably isn't the place, Joelle. He never thinks he's appreciated. It's exhausting.
Do you believe that?
Go find better then.
She said it with a smile, like she was doing me a favor. In front of her mother, her sister, everyone at that table, she told me to go find better, as if I hadn't already been thinking about it. What she didn't know was that the suitcase had been packed for 3 weeks. The accounts had been traced, the evidence copied, and my oldest friend already knew everything she thought she'd hidden. She handed me the door, certain she held every card. But when that mistake finally came due, who do you think was left holding the bill? If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because the people on this channel never go down without a fight. The first time I walked into that warehouse near the harbor, it smelled like salt water and old timber. Marissa stood beside me, looking at the cracked walls and the rusted roof beams, and she said it could be something. I believed her because I already knew what it could become. I had been drawing versions of it in my sketchbook for years. We signed the lease together on a Tuesday in early spring, and by that weekend I had a workbench set up and my tools laid out in rows along the back wall. That was 12 years ago. That was how Northline Restoration Studio began. I was the one who worked through the nights. When a client wanted a hand-carved mantelpiece restored to its original profile, I was the one on my knees with a chisel at 2 in the morning working under a single shop light. When an estate in Bar Harbor needed its library paneling matched to wood that hadn't been milled since the 1940s, I spent 3 weeks sourcing the right grain walnut and cutting every piece by hand. The work was slow and it was exact, and there was no shortcut that didn't show up later. I understood that the way you understand something you've known since you were a kid watching your father work. Marissa understood the other half of the business. She was sharp in a room full of wealthy people. She knew when to listen, when to speak, and how to make a client feel like they had discovered something rare instead of simply hired a craftsman. She could walk someone through a design concept in a way that made them feel like it had always been their idea. That skill had real value, and I never questioned it. In the early years, we divided the work cleanly, and the division felt fair between us. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being fair, and I didn't notice until the shift was already complete. The first time I saw my name left off a magazine feature, I assumed it was an editorial choice. The article focused on Marissa's vision for Northline, her eye for period-accurate restoration, her instinct for pairing antique materials with contemporary interiors. My name appeared once in a caption listed as the production lead. I mentioned it to Marissa, and she said it was just how the journalist had framed it, that readers connected more with a single creative identity. I accepted that because the business was growing and the work was good, and I told myself the credit didn't matter as long as the quality did. But the pattern continued. The Harbor Line Collection. 6 pieces I had designed and built across nearly 6 years. Each one drawn from scratch and refined through dozens of iterations was presented in a catalog under Marissa's name alone. She was photographed beside the dining table. I had spent 4 months building the grain matched across every panel, the joinery tight enough that no one would ever find a gap. The catalog described her as the creative force behind the collection. I was not mentioned anywhere in it. When I brought it up at home, she told me I was being sensitive. She said the business needed a face, and she was better suited to be that face. And she wasn't wrong that she was better at the public side of things. But there is a difference between being the face of something and erasing the person who built it. I stayed quiet because I didn't want the argument, and because some part of me still believed the credit would come eventually, that she would find a moment to correct the record. That moment never came. Her mother, Lorraine, had always treated our marriage like a rescue story where Marissa was the rescuer. She made small comments at family dinners about how lucky I was to have a wife who knew how to talk to the right people about how Marissa had given Northline its identity and its direction. She said these things the way you say something you genuinely believe, which made them harder to push back against than if she had been openly cruel. Marissa's younger sister, Brooke, was quieter about it, but held the same general view that I was a good craftsman who had been given access to a bigger world through my wife's connections, and that this was simply the natural order of things. I had stopped arguing with that version of the story by the time I found the invoice. It was a Tuesday evening. I was going through the Northline accounts, something I did at the end of each month to track material costs and vendor payments. The invoice was filed under a supplier name. I recognized a high-end lumber distributor we used regularly, but the delivery address was wrong. Instead of the studio, the materials were logged as shipped to an address in Cedar Key, a waterfront district about 20 minutes from Ashford Harbor. The recipient listed was Damon Sloan. I knew the name. Marisa had mentioned him several times over the past few months, a real estate investor she had been meeting with about potential commercial projects. I hadn't thought much about it because she met a lot of people. But this invoice wasn't a meeting. This was a shipment of black walnut slabs and Italian marble tile worth several $1,000s delivered to an address that had nothing to do with Northline. I went to the stockroom and did a physical count. The walnut was short. The marble was short. I sat with that for a long time before going back to the computer and working through the financial records more carefully. What I found over the next 2 hours wasn't dramatic. It never is when someone is being careful. There were no single large transfers. Nothing that would catch the eye at a glance. There were dozens of small ones instead, amounts that fit inside ordinary line items. A consulting fee here, a branding expense there, a payment to a vendor I didn't recognize for a service I couldn't verify anywhere. When I added them all up, the total came to just over $52,400 moved out of Northline's operating accounts. I searched Damon Sloan's name and found real estate listings, a business profile, a mention in a local journal. Then in the image results, I found a photograph of a showroom interior in Cedar Key walls, still unfinished lighting, not yet installed, but already dressed with sample pieces and large format renderings. On one wall, printed wide enough to fill the frame, was an illustration of the Harbor Line dining table. My table. The same proportions. The same grain pattern, the same quietly curved legs I had revised 17 times before I was satisfied with them. The logo in the corner of the rendering was not Northline. It read, Voss House. I did not call Marisa. I called Felix Rowan. Felix and I had known each other since our 20s, back when we were both working out of the same industrial building on the edge of town, him doing early bookkeeping work, me building custom furniture out of a rented bay. He had built a career as a forensic accounting specialist, the kind of person companies called when something felt wrong, but no one could yet say exactly what. When I told him what I'd found, he didn't suggest I might be misreading it. He told me to stop touching anything in the system, screenshot what I already had, and begin copying every file I could access before Marisa had any reason to think I'd been looking. Over the days that followed, I worked quietly. I backed up the full design archive, every original drawing, every revision file, every dated project folder going back to the studio's first year. I photographed documents, exported account statements, and saved every email thread I could locate. I put the suitcase in the storage room at our house on a Thursday night, already packed and ready to go. I didn't tell anyone it was there. The invitation to Lorraine's anniversary dinner arrived the following week. A family gathering at the Voss house. Nothing unusual on its surface. I went because not going would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. I brought the suitcase with me and left it in my car in the driveway, not because I planned to use it that night, but because I had already decided that if the right moment came, I wouldn't need to go back for anything. Marisa was energized that evening in a way I recognized she got like that before something she had been planning was about to become real. Halfway through the meal, she tapped her glass and stood up. She announced that she was launching a new brand, a high-end interior furnishings line called Voss House. She introduced Damon as a strategic investment partner and described the showroom at Cedar Key as the first location in what she hoped would grow into a regional presence. She talked about her creative vision, her years of building Northline's reputation, her instinct for merging antique craftsmanship with the way people wanted to live now. She had a tablet at the table and she pulled up images. The Harbor Line collection filled the screen. My chairs, my dining table, the cabinet I had built as a quiet tribute to a joinery style my father had taught me when I was 12 years old. My name was not in any of it. I asked quietly enough that it didn't stop the room whether she planned to credit the designer of those pieces anywhere in the Voss House presentation. Marissa smiled the way you smile at something mildly inconvenient. She said I had helped realize her concepts and that she appreciated my contribution. Lorraine added that a craftsman and a creative director were different roles, and that I shouldn't confuse technical skill with vision. I told them both that I had spent more than a decade building what was now being presented as someone else's work, that I had drawn every piece on that screen, that the Harbor Line had taken nearly 6 years of my life. Marissa looked around the table with a small sound of tired amusement. She said I always felt underappreciated, that it wore on her that she didn't know what I expected anymore. Then she told me to go find better. The table laughed. Brooke looked down at her plate without saying anything. Lorraine refilled her glass. Marissa settled back into her chair with the expression of someone who had just closed a conversation they were done having. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue about. I stood up, walked outside to my car, and came back in with the suitcase I had packed 3 weeks earlier and carried with me that evening for exactly this reason. The room went silent in the way rooms go silent when something happens that no one had prepared for. Marissa rose from her chair, her expression moving from amusement to something closer to alarm as she registered what she was seeing. I told her she had been wrong about one thing. I wasn't looking for a better woman. I was looking for a life where I didn't have to ask permission to be treated as a person who had actually built something. I picked up the suitcase, walked to the front door, and stepped outside. Behind me, no one at that table said a single word. The door closed. I stood in the cold Maine air outside the Voss house, and for the first time in longer than I could account for, I felt the particular kind of quiet that only comes when you stop pretending something is fine. I spent the first night in a room above an old boat-building yard at the edge of Ashford Harbor. The owner was a man I had done some mill work for years back, and he let me use the space without asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. The room had a sloped ceiling, a window that faced the water, and a radiator that clicked through the night like something trying to speak. I lay on top of the covers with my coat on and thought about the invoice, the images of that showroom, and the way Marissa had looked at me across the dinner table, not angry, not guilty, but inconvenienced, as if I had interrupted something she had already mentally completed. Felix came by the next morning with coffee and his laptop. He had been working since I called him from the car the night before, and what he had found was more organized than I had expected, which somehow made it worse. The money hadn't been moved carelessly. It had been moved methodically through a company called Voss and Sloan Living LLC, registered 8 months earlier in the state of Maine. Damon Sloan was listed as the operating manager, but the bank accounts, the vendor contracts, and the supplier agreements were all linked to Marissa's personal credentials. Damon was the name on the door. Marissa was the one with the keys. The $52,400 from Northline's operating accounts had gone toward the Cedar Key showroom lease. The material orders I had already traced a branding agency and a launch event that had not yet happened. Felix also found that Marissa had exported a full copy of Northline's client database 3 months earlier. Every contact, every past project, every active relationship the studio had built over 12 years. The plan, as Felix read it from the financial architecture, was to migrate the wealthiest clients to Voss House, let Northline's revenue dry up, and allow the studio to collapse under its own debt. When it did, Marissa would have a clean story. Her husband had mismanaged production. She had built the business's reputation, and she had been forced to start fresh on her own. It was a story that had been written before I ever walked out of that dinner. Felix told me to sit still and not confront anyone yet. If Marissa detected that we were reconstructing the financial trail, she could delete email threads, shift assets, and restructure the company ownership in a matter of hours. Everything depended on staying quiet long enough to build something she couldn't dismantle with a password change. That discipline was harder than it sounds when you are living above a boatyard and watching your wife post photographs of your furniture on a social media account for a business that has no legal right to any of it. 2 weeks into that waiting period, Felix found the loan document. It had been filed inside a project folder labeled with the name of a completed client job from the previous year, a renovation in Kennebunkport that had closed out with no outstanding issues. Inside that folder, buried under invoices and material specs, was a credit agreement for $186,000. The loan had been used to finance the Voss House build-out, the structural renovation of the Cedar Key space, the lighting and display systems, the custom cabinetry, and wall treatments. The collateral listed was the full equipment inventory of Northline Restoration Studio, every machine, every tool, every asset we had accumulated over 12 years of operation. At the bottom of the document was my signature as personal guarantor. I had never seen that document before in my life. Felix photographed the signature page and sent it to a forensic document examiner he had worked with on a corporate fraud case 2 years prior. The preliminary finding came back within a week. The signature had been digitally extracted from an older contract. The examiner identified the source document as a vendor agreement I had signed during Northline's 3rd year and repositioned into the loan file before it was submitted electronically. It had been done carefully. Not perfectly, but carefully enough that a bank processing a routine application would not have flagged it. What that meant in plain terms was this: if Voss House failed, I would be personally responsible for $186,000 I had never agreed to borrow, and the machinery that would be seized to cover it would include the lathe. My father had left me a tool he had used for 30 years before his hands gave out, one I had rebuilt and maintained and carried with me from my first small shop to Northline's warehouse. It was the one thing in that studio that had nothing to do with Marissa or the business or anything we had built together. It was simply his and then mine. I needed to look Damon Sloan in the eye. I found him at a storage facility near Cedar Key, where Voss House materials were being staged. I had not told Felix I was going. I kept the meeting short, and I kept it factual. Damon's first response was that Marissa had told him we were separated and that I had already agreed to license the Harbor Line designs to the new venture. He said it in the tone of someone who had rehearsed the explanation but had never fully believed it. When I set the loan document on the hood of his car and pointed to the signature, he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. I asked him directly whether he had seen signs that the paperwork wasn't legitimate. He told me he had noticed that the vendor contracts moved quickly and that some of the authorization trails were thin, but that Marissa had explained the timeline was compressed because of a lease deadline. He had accepted that explanation because Marissa had offered him 20% equity in Voss House and the right to develop the brand into a chain across the Northeast. He had looked away from the things that didn't add up because the things that did add up were worth a great deal of money to him. He said this without much emotion, as if he were describing a business calculation rather than a choice, which I suppose was exactly what it had been. I left Cedar Key with the confirmation I already suspected Damon Sloan had not been deceived. He had simply decided that someone else's loss was an acceptable cost for his gain. 3 days later, Marissa discovered I had backed up the company's design archive. I don't know exactly how she found out, whether someone at the studio noticed the file transfer logs or whether she had been watching the system. What I know is that by 8 in the morning on a Wednesday, my access to every Northline account had been revoked and the passwords changed. Felix received a call from a business attorney that afternoon informing him that Ethan Calder was no longer an authorized representative of Northline Restoration Studio, and that any further access to company systems would be considered a breach. By that evening, Marissa had told the studio's staff that I had walked out following a personal dispute and was no longer involved in operations. She told at least 2 long-standing clients that I had been struggling with significant personal difficulties and that she was managing the situation. One of them was Carol Whitfield, a client we had worked with for 6 years across a series of estate restoration projects, who called me directly to say she wasn't comfortable proceeding with any new work while there was an active family conflict in progress. I thanked her and didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about yet. Lorraine called the following morning. She told me that what I had done walking out the way I did, embarrassing Marissa in front of family, was something she would have a very hard time forgiving. She asked me what kind of man abandons his wife at the most important moment of her career. I listened to all of it without interrupting her. When she finished, I told her I hoped she would ask Marissa to show her the loan document and explain whose signature was on it. Lorraine told me I was being paranoid and ended the call. Felix found the original partnership agreement from 12 years earlier, the one Marissa and I had signed when we incorporated Northline. One of its provisions stated that the creator of any design work retained personal copyright and the right to continued use of that work if the partnership was dissolved. It was a standard clause that neither of us had thought much about at the time because we had been too focused on whether the business would survive its first year. That clause was now the most important sentence in any document connected to my name. The problem was evidence. To establish that I had created the Harbor Line collection and the other key designs we needed, the original drawings, the dated sketch files, the production logs, the version histories from the early development phases. Felix had helped me copy everything I could reach before my access was cut. But the oldest records, the ones from Northline's first 4 years when I was still keeping physical binders, were stored in the studio's back office in a cabinet I could no longer open. Brooke reached out to me on a Thursday evening through a text message that simply asked if I was available to talk. I called her back from the boatyard, standing outside in the cold because the signal was better away from the building. She told me that Marissa had asked her to tell their family that I had made threats against the Voss house opening, that I had said something about making sure it didn't happen. Brooke told me she had repeated of it because she had never heard me say anything remotely like that, and she wasn't willing to say I had. She asked me what was actually going on. I didn't ask her to take my side. I told her there was one question I thought she should put to her sister. If everything Marissa had done was legitimate, why was my signature on a loan document I had never signed? Brooke was quiet for a long moment after that. She said she would think about it. I told her that was all I was asking and ended the call. The following week, before Felix had finished assembling the full evidentiary package, Marissa filed a motion for a temporary restraining order. The filing accused me of misappropriating proprietary business data and stated that I posed a credible threat to the Voss House launch event scheduled for the coming weekend. Because Marissa was the primary signatory on Northline's client accounts and held the active business license in her name, the motion was granted on a preliminary basis. I was prohibited from entering the Northline premises or contacting clients until the dispute could be reviewed by the court. The same day the order was served, the bank froze Northline's operating accounts pending an investigation into the loan agreement with my forged signature. Without access to the accounts, the studio couldn't cover the rent that had already been running late for months late, because Marissa had been redirecting cash to Voss House instead of paying the studio's obligations. The landlord's representative arrived 2 days later and changed the locks. I drove to the studio and stood outside in the parking lot. Through the plate glass of the front window, I could see the interior I had built out myself, the workbenches I had designed, the dust collection system I had installed on a weekend in November 3 years ago. The wall of hand tools arranged the way I had arranged them since the studio's first month. In the far corner, visible under the fluorescent lights, was my father's lathe with an asset inventory sticker already affixed to its base. Felix met me in that parking lot. He had a folder with him and a look I recognized from people who are about to say something they know you don't want to hear, but need to. He told me there was a path through this that didn't require going further. Marissa's attorney had communicated informally that she would be willing to accept a settlement in which I transferred my ownership interest in Northline and agreed not to pursue the design copyright claims. In exchange, she would accept full personal liability for the loan. The $186,000 would become entirely her responsibility, and my name would be removed from the guarantee. Felix was careful to present it neutrally, the way a good advisor does when he knows the decision belongs to you. But I understood what he was actually describing. If I signed, I would walk away from the debt. I would also walk away from every design I had ever created for Northline, every drawing, every collection, every piece I had built with my own hands over 12 years. They would become Marissa's by default, packaged inside Voss House, manufactured under her name, sold to people who would never know anyone else had made them. I stood in that parking lot for a long time, looking through the window at the lathe. I had learned to use that machine when I was 9 years old, sitting on an overturned milk crate beside my father while he talked me through every adjustment. He had not been a man who explained things twice. You either learned by watching or you asked, and if you asked, you paid close attention to the answer. What he had left me was not the machine itself, but the understanding inside it, the accumulated precision of knowing how to make something true. I was not going to let that become a line item in someone else's asset inventory. I told Felix I wasn't signing anything. He nodded once closed the folder and said he needed 48 more hours. I told him to take whatever he needed and drove back to the boatyard as the sun went down over the harbor and the lights on the water began to blur in the cold. Felix called me at 6 in the morning on the day of the Voss House launch. He told me to get dressed and drive to his office, that things had moved faster than the 48 hours he had asked for. When I got there, he had 2 laptops open on his desk and a cardboard box sitting on the floor beside his chair. He told me to look at the box first. Brooke had driven to Lorraine's house the previous evening under the pretense of dropping off some things she had stored there. She knew from years of watching her sister operate that Marissa periodically moved sensitive materials to their mother's home when she didn't want them accessible at Northline. What Brooke found in a cabinet in the back hallway was an external hard drive in a canvas pouch, the kind you buy at an electronics store, and don't bother to label because you assume you'll always know what's on it. Brooke had plugged it into her laptop before she left the house and found what was on it. Then she had driven directly to Felix. The drive contained the design archive from Northline's first 4 years. The physical binders I had mentioned to Felix weeks earlier now digitized and stored. It had every original drawing for the Harbor Line collection dated from the first rough sketches through 17 documented revisions of the dining table alone. There were video files recordings I had made for my own reference while building the pieces, narrating the process in the way you do when you're working through a problem out loud and want to be able to review your own reasoning later. In several of those recordings, I was on camera at the bench in the workshop, working on pieces that now sat in a showroom under someone else's name. And there were messages Marissa had sent to a client 3 years earlier during a dispute over a modification to a custom piece, in which she had written explicitly that Ethan was the designer of the collection and that any structural changes would need to go through him for approval. That last item was the one that settled something in my chest that had been unsteady for weeks. Felix also told me about Damon. Sometime in the 10 days before the launch, Marissa had quietly amended the Voss and Sloan Living operating agreement. Damon's equity stake had been reduced significantly, with the change structured to take effect automatically upon the company's first commercial transaction, meaning the moment the distribution contract was signed at the launch event that evening. Damon had discovered the amendment while reviewing documents for a separate legal matter, and had understood immediately what it meant that Marissa had planned from the beginning to cut him out once the business was established enough not to need him. He had called Felix directly, not out of remorse for anything he had done, but because he understood that if Voss House collapsed under fraud allegations, he was the only name on the operating documents and the most obvious target for civil liability. He handed Felix every email between himself and Marissa going back 8 months, including one in which she had addressed in writing the question of the loan authorization and confirmed that she was handling it through documents Ethan had already signed in another context. That sentence in Marissa's own words in an email with her name and timestamp was the only document we needed that we hadn't already had. The launch event was scheduled for 8 o'clock that evening in the Cedar Key showroom. A real estate journalist had confirmed he would be there along with 3 investors Marissa had been cultivating for months and a group of Northline's longest-standing clients who had been invited under the impression they were attending a preview of an exciting new design venture. I drove to Cedar Key alone. I arrived just before 8 while people were still moving through the entrance and the caterers were arranging glasses near the back wall. The showroom looked exactly like my furniture deserved to look good. Lighting, generous spacing, the pieces placed to breathe. I had to acknowledge that even then. The Harbor Line dining table was at the center of the room, and it looked the way I had always imagined it would look in a space that was designed around it rather than accommodating it as an afterthought. What it did not have was my name anywhere near it. Marissa saw me within 30 seconds of my walking in. She crossed the room with the expression of someone who had already prepared for this possibility and was not particularly concerned about it. She told the people nearest to her lightly that her estranged husband had apparently decided to make an appearance and that she hoped everyone would bear with her for a moment. The implication was clear. This was a man who couldn't accept his wife's success, who had shown up to make a scene at the worst possible moment and who should be gently managed and ignored. I didn't respond to any of it. I walked to the table that had been set up near the entrance, the kind event planners use for programs and business cards, and I set down the folder Felix had prepared. It was about 2 inches thick. I opened it and began to lay documents across the table in the order Felix and I had arranged them, the financial transfer records showing $52,400 moved from Northline to Voss and Sloan, living the forensic analysis of the forged signature on the loan agreement. The original Northline partnership agreement with the design copyright provision highlighted the dated files from the hard drive and the printed email in which Marissa had identified me by name as the designer of the Harbor Line collection. The last document I placed was the email chain between Marissa and Damon that included her written acknowledgement of how the loan authorization had been handled. Marissa's attorney, who had accompanied her to the event, moved toward the table. The representative from the bank that had issued the $186,000 loan was also present. He had been invited because the distribution contract signing required a financial witness. He was the one who stepped forward first, reviewed what was in front of him for about 90 seconds, and informed Marissa that he was placing the credit agreement in suspension pending a formal fraud review. The distribution contract could not be signed while the underlying collateral was under investigation. The room shifted. I watched the two investors exchange a look and take a step back from the conversation. Carol Whitfield, who had been among the Northline clients invited to the event, walked to the table and looked at the photographs from the hard drive. She recognized the pieces. She and I had spent 6 years working together on her family's estate projects, and she knew whose hands had made what she was looking at. She glanced at me, then at Marissa, and without saying a word, she took out her phone and photographed the email with my name in it before quietly stepping back into the room. Lorraine had been standing near the back of the room. She came forward and told me in a low, firm voice that whatever I believed had happened, this was not the place, and I needed to stop before I destroyed something that could not be repaired. I was going to respond when Brooke stepped in from my left. Brooke addressed the room directly. She said she had found the hard drive the previous evening at her mother's house. She said it contained original design files that predated anything Marissa had ever claimed as her own creative work. And she said that her sister had asked her 2 weeks earlier to tell their family that Ethan had made threats against the showroom and that she had refused to say it because it wasn't true. Lorraine turned to look at her younger daughter with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not defense, but a kind of stillness that meant she had run out of things to say. Marissa turned to me then with something that had finally broken through the composure she had maintained all evening. She said I had done this because of one comment at a dinner table that I had burned everything down because my pride couldn't survive a single bad night. Her voice was loud enough that the room had gone quiet around it. I told her she was wrong about what had happened and wrong about why. I hadn't left that dinner because of what she said. I had left because of what the saying of it revealed: 12 years of a marriage in which she had looked at the person who built everything she was now selling and decided his name wasn't worth keeping. It wasn't a bad night. It was the night I finally understood what all the other nights had actually been. She hadn't wanted me gone from our marriage. She had wanted me gone from the record of what I had made, erased from the work itself, as if I had never stood at that bench or held that chisel or given that collection a shape worth putting in a showroom at all. I gathered the documents from the table and walked out. The legal resolution moved more quickly than I expected, partly because Damon's cooperation removed Marissa's ability to contest the financial evidence, and partly because the forensic analysis of the signature was unambiguous. The bank's investigation confirmed that I had not signed the loan guarantee, and my personal liability for the $186,000 was formally discharged. The accounts connected to Voss and Sloan Living were frozen while the civil matter was reviewed, and without operating capital, the showroom lease at Cedar Key was terminated within weeks. The partnership agreement did its work, with the design files from the hard drive establishing dated authorship. The copyright provision gave me clear standing to reclaim the Harbor Line collection and all associated intellectual property. Marissa's attorney eventually communicated that she was willing to sell her interest in Northline rather than continue a legal dispute she was no longer positioned to win. The settlement price was offset against the funds she had transferred out of the studio's accounts, which left her with considerably less than she had anticipated when she began moving money 8 months earlier. Damon cooperated fully with the civil proceedings and provided documentation that reduced his direct liability. He did not walk away unaffected. His reputation in the regional investment community took the kind of damage that doesn't fully repair, but he avoided the worst of it by being the first person in the room to hand over everything he had. Lorraine never apologized. What she did instead was stop. She stopped calling me lucky. She stopped describing Marissa's vision as the engine behind Northline's success. When I saw her briefly during the final legal proceedings, she looked at me the way people look at something they have been wrong about for a long time and have not yet found the language to address. I didn't require anything more from her. I had not come through any of this looking to collect acknowledgments from people who had never thought much of me. I only needed them to stop reshaping what had actually happened. Brooke called me the week after the launch. She apologized for laughing at that dinner table for the automatic, unconsidered way she had joined in when Marissa told me to find better. She said she had spent years assuming that the person in the room who spoke the loudest was the one doing the most important work, and that she had been wrong about what important work actually looked like. I told her I appreciated that and meant it. The divorce was handled without a public conflict because neither of us had any interest in extending the fight beyond its necessary dimensions. I signed what needed to be signed and did not contest what did not need contesting. I took what was mine, the designs, the equipment, the client relationships that were still intact, and I let everything else go cleanly. A year later, I opened True Grain Workshop in a converted fire station 3 blocks from the harbor in Ashford Harbor. I chose the name deliberately. In woodworking, the true grain is what's underneath the actual structure of the material, the pattern that was always there before anything was applied to the surface. It was also the most honest description I had for what I had been trying to do for 12 years inside a business that had progressively obscured the people doing the real work. The sign above the door listed my name and below mine, the names of 3 craftsmen and 2 apprentices who worked in the shop. That was not a gesture. It was a policy. No one who built something inside those walls would find their name missing from it. The Harbor Line collection was displayed along the east wall of the main room, each piece accompanied by its original drawings and a written account of its construction history. The dining table stood at the center. The grain matched across every panel the way I had always intended it to be shown. My father's lathe was positioned at the center of the workshop floor where it had always belonged. Beside it, on a low shelf I had built from a piece of reclaimed pine, sat the suitcase I had carried out of the Voss house on the night everything changed. Some people who came through the shop assumed it was a design object, something I had repurposed for display. I never corrected them. It was enough that I knew what it was. Marissa had told me to go find better, and I did, just not in the way she expected. What I found was not a different life or a different version of the same one. What I found was a workbench. I didn't have to apologize for a sign with my name on it, and the understanding that the most important step I had taken in 12 years was not the one that built something. It was the one that finally walked away from a place that had made me forget what I was worth. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I think some of you may recognize pieces of this story from your own lives. The people who do the quiet work, who show up early, who solve the problems that don't get photographed, who build the things that other people put their names on, those people are not weak for staying patient. But patience has a limit, and knowing where that limit is may be the most important thing you ever learn about yourself. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, and you do not owe anyone the erasure of your own name. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and stay with this channel, because every week we tell the stories of people who chose their own dignity over a comfortable silence and who came out the other side with something worth keeping.